What exactly do you think can be achieved by Secretary of State?
Tillerson has left Doha this afternoon, after his meeting with the Emir of Qatar and the Foreign Minister, there was no press conference, no communication with the media. What this is maybe an indicator that the diplomatic or the effort what's done from Tillerson in the last 48 hours has not led to something clear yet. What we assume or what we are sure of, that this is the day number 39 of the crisis. The four countries insist on their demands. Qatar believe that these demands is unrealistic, and it's touched the issue of sovereignty of Qatar. We have a new effort will be started Saturday by the French Foreign Minister, who will come to the region, and also it's expected that the President Erdogan will visit also Doha and Riyadh. So this is, it seems all of these efforts are coming, just following each other to create sort of breaking through and solve this through diplomacy.
Right. Mr. Al-Ahmed, do you think any breakthrough can happen even with Secretary of State visit followed by two others coming from Turkey and elsewhere?
I doubt it at the foreseeable future, because the two sides are very much stuck on their position. Qatar is not willing to surrender its sovereignty, and the Saudi bloc does not want Qatar to have an independent decision. So I don't think there is a place for meeting here, or a place for them, a common ground for the two sides. The American role here is not to solve the problem, really, is to prolong it, because it serves the American stated goals of forcing the Gulf countries to stop what they call supporting of terrorism. So all sides are charged by the Americans of doing that. So they are trying to use this opportunity to pressure all the sides to give up supporting and funding terrorism.
But it seems that Secretary of State, Mr. Tillerson, has been somewhat successful, at least in pushing Qatar to do something about that. Mr. Tillerson signed a deal with Qatar to clamp down on, quote, financing for terrorists. The memo of understanding calls for the U.S. and Qatar to share information that zeroes in on sources of terrorism financing in the coming years. But the agreement falls short of Saudi-led quartet's expectations, even though it is being said in that way. But as we all know, Mr. Al-Ahmed, what Secretary Tillerson wants, and also what Washington wants, is also similar memo and agreement coming from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and some of the other countries, just as those being signed between Qatar and the United States.
Well, the Americans signed a similar memo or agreement with Saudi Arabia 11-12 years ago, and that did not stop Saudi, thousands of Saudis traveling to fight with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, Iraq, and other countries. So it is a memorandum of understanding. It's not really an agreement legally. So I doubt it will change much, and it's not significant in that from a legal point of view. It's not really significant, but I think it shows that the Tillerson approach is supporting the Qatari position here, and I think that was intentional, so he can balance the two sides, because Qatar stands alone vis-a-vis the majority of the GCC.
That's right.
And plus Egypt, so 3+1, yeah.
So, Professor, I want to have you, Mr. Zweiri, very importantly respond to 2 points.
If you allow me,
2 points. I need to respond.
If you allow me just to comment.
Yes, you will have your chance, but you need to respond 2 points. One is whether this agreement is really useful or not, as your colleague earlier commented. Secondly is Secretary Tillerson's apparent try to, quote, side with Qatar on this issue, as your colleague also previously mentioned. 2 points, sir. Go ahead.
First of all, this memorandum is being prepared in the last year. So basically, it has nothing to deal with this crisis. According to the the information I have, that this is an outcome of a discussion between Doha and Washington for nearly 1 year. And this is the outcome, which is basically signing this memorandum. So we should not really link it with this or put it in the context of this crisis. The rejection of this memorandum from the Quartet is just is an indicator that they are not showing flexibility in terms of finding solution. The other point, if I want to just to zoom in on Tillerson's position, Tillerson and his colleague, the Department of Pentagon, they were facing a problem with the White House in the last 3-4 weeks because the president has different view on the crisis, and they tried to create a balance. The visit to me of Tillerson means that there is a one voice in Washington now toward this crisis, and this is the reason why Tillerson, I think, came to the region and he started his effort to support the Kuwaiti mediator. Tillerson is basically has 2 main concerns. One is to confirm that Qatar is actually cooperating with the United States in terms of war on terror, and there is nearly 20 years of cooperation between 2 countries.
Right.
And his department and the Pentagon, they have the real information about this. The second issue, Tillerson does not seem convinced that the 13 demand or request from the 4 countries are realistic. Basically, he believed that those are forgotten and no longer on the table, and that was his first message when he touched on in Kuwait. So basically, he wanted a plan B. Plan B, he wanted more flexibility from 4 countries, which basically protect and guarantee the sovereignty of Qatar.
And now we are also joined from Washington, D.C., Joe Rubin, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Mr. Rubin, welcome to our program. Rushing over, thank you so much. I want you to respond about your colleague's comments. The division in Washington between the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department about what to do in the Middle East. We all know all of this seem to be circling around us, dramatic stories after President Trump's visit to the Middle East earlier. So, Mr. Rubin, you want to comment about that first?
Yes. Yes, thank you, and thank you for having me. And the changes in American policy towards the Middle East are significant, but not clear at this stage. And the White House has been undergoing multiple policy reviews on Iran, on Syria, on other issues of concern to try to figure out its next steps. But in the meantime, this Gulf crisis has as world events always do, come in and just, in a sense, it injected itself in the midst of the discussion, regardless of the well-laid planning of the White House. And I agree with the previous speaker. I do believe that the disconnect between the State Department, the Defense Department, and the White House has created a dynamic of confusion about where the administration wants to go on this Gulf crisis. And Secretary Tillerson is trying to show leadership in stepping into it, and he has a lot of support for trying to resolve this on Capitol Hill as well.
But obviously he has not been successful, at least for now. There has not been, as mentioned earlier, any public announcement about that. More regional leaders are going to the region trying to handle the situation, not likely to come out with any possible result either. So what are we seeing right now? Is Washington losing control of persuasion power over its Gulf region allies, whether it's Qatar or some of the other countries as well?
I think that we are at a very, very critical inflection point. There was an expectation after President Trump's visit to the Gulf that there would be unity amongst the Sunnis, and in a sense, the tearing apart of that by this crisis has really undermined that perception that President Trump has the ability to corral the Gulf countries and the Sunni Arab world in a unified action. And so as a result of that, there is growing actual skepticism and concern about Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, United Arab Emirates, and why are they continuing to reject calls for moderation, calls for a reconciliation process? What's really behind their motivations? And it could boomerang into, and we saw this recently several weeks ago in congressional voices of concern about Saudi Arabia when there was a vote where 47 out of 100 senators voted to oppose an arms sale to Saudi Arabia. That's very close to being rejected. So in the meantime, this uncertainty, it does put the United States in a difficult leadership position, but we are the essential ingredient here to bringing the parties together.
Okay.
But we do need to see Saudi Arabia and the Emirates step into it as well.
But you know, this is a very weird situation, Mr. Al-Ahmed, if you know what I'm talking about. That is, earlier we have seen from the Obama administration, even toward the Trump administration, talking about the U.S. From now on, do not have to depend on the situation in the Middle East because the U.S. have got shale gas. It do not need to depend on the energy coming from that region anymore. It's going to set the U.S. free. But now you think about that. Before that has been achieved by Washington, it seems that the Gulf countries are already taking on their own life in a way and not necessarily listen to Washington anymore, at least for now. Mr. Al-Ahmed, what do you think about that?
Well, I think for a long time, the Gulf countries have actually been almost getting the United States to do their to carry out their policy. If you look at the wars, the American wars in Iraq, most of them were done on behalf of Gulf countries, of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and to further their ends. The war in Yemen, for example, is another example of how the Saudis got the Americans and the British to do their dirty work for them. It is true that the narrative that America needs Gulf oil was really, this was almost created out of nothing, because if we looked at the numbers, the oil that comes from the Gulf countries is about $50 billion a year, where the oil that's coming out of the Venezuela, for example, is greater than that, or out of Canada. But nobody talks about the bad relationship between the US and Venezuela and link it to oil. So really here it was created by PR companies and by politicians in the United States to justify American support to GCC countries. I just want to add that Bob Corker, the most important senator in terms of foreign policy, also yesterday accused Saudi Arabia of funding terrorism. So we are looking at a situation where so many players are involved, and that's why this crisis will be longer and will extend way more than we think. And at the end of the day, both sides will lose because they will drain their resources to the benefit of arms dealers and politicians abroad.
And this is what exactly we're talking about here, Professor Zweiri, because if you have friends in the Gulf regions now, they would tell you everything has come to a stop right now because of the chaotic situation for the relations among these countries. Nothing can be done. No business deals, major ones, of course, I'm talking about. Not necessarily cross-country relations being conducted at this point. And also, when you talk about anti-terrorism and many other things going on in the region, it's all come to a stop. So, Professor Zweiri, what are we embracing now as a result of all of this? What is in the horizon? It's kind of dangerous, isn't it? Briefly.
It is a dangerous situation. This crisis, there are two things here we are witnessing in the region. The demonization, for example, of Qatar through the public opinion, and the other one is the culture of hatred between the people and the Gulf. And that is something we have not witnessed in modern history at all. And I think this crisis, the economic loss, for example, is not actually the loss of Qatar, it's the loss of all players. And as one of the politicians said, that if Qatar loses $1, others will lose also $1 as well. So basically, it is the loss for all players, because this is an important region. The world keeps its eyes on the region.
Right.
It's important for the source of energy. It's important for sort of stability and security. And any instability will affect not only the region but also beyond the region.
That's right.
We witnessed, for example, the statement from China that they wanted the countries to work quickly and fix this problem, because basically there will be a bad ramification. And I think there is a concern also of Japan and Europeans.
Right.
For that reason, we witnessed a lot of effort from Germany, for example, and as I mentioned, France as well is joining, and also the British. So basically, it is a very, we are in a very critical time.
This is a critical time. This is a critical time. That's why we need to figure out some solutions. And Mr. Rubin, therefore, I want to go to you before we wrap it up. Ramifications, negative ones, that's all we are concerned about. Little things in the Middle East could be always spur out of control, as we say. What can Washington do now? If Washington at the very beginning planted seeds of instability, what can Washington now do to revive the crisis? One Secretary of State is not enough.
One Secretary of State is not enough, and it's an open secret that the United States military values Qatar, has a strong relationship with Qatar through our air base, Al-Ahmed, in Qatar, as well as through support that Qatar has provided to the Free Syrian Army in Syria, opposing Assad, support for airstrikes that we have executed. So we need a whole of government approach. We need the Defense Department and the State Department to lean in, and the United States needs to make it very clear to the regional allies that we have, like Saudi Arabia as well, that they need to change their approach, that this is bad for our security, it's bad for their security, it's bad for the fight against the Islamic State, and it needs to come to an end quickly.
All right. Mr. Al-Ahmed, the final word for you, 20 seconds if you can, sir. We're running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the crisis will continue, and I think the American administration is trying to make it longer because it's beneficial. There is division of labor here, and I think because, like I said before, it's advantageous for the United States to continue this crisis.
Yeah.